Montana Territory, 1883, the wind howled off the crazy mountains as Laurel Hargrove stepped down from the stagecoach with a rifle strapped to her back, a baby on her hip, and her 6-year-old son clinging to her skirt. The hem of her dress was stiff with old dust, her boots cracked, and her face set like stone. She was not here to fall in love, she was here to start over. "I ain't looking for love," she said, more to herself than anyone else. A man leaned against the split-rail fence by the general store, one boot crossed over the other, hat tipped low. He looked like he belonged to the land, dust on his trousers, sun on his neck, quiet in his eyes. When he heard her words, he did not smile, he just said, "Just sit a while." She turned. "What?" He rested his forearms on the fence rail, eyes steady. "You look like you've been running a long time." "I have." "Then maybe sit a while." Laurel narrowed her eyes. "You always talk to strangers like this?" "Only the ones that look like they need a place to breathe." He tipped his hat back then. "Name's Silas Fletcher." Her son Jacob peeked from behind her skirt. "Mama, I'm hungry," Laurel sighed. Her heart felt like a dried-up well. "You know where I could find work?" she asked Silas. He nodded. "The widow Barnes runs the boarding house, needs help in the kitchen. Pays honest. There's room upstairs, too." Laurel hesitated. She had not come to this dust-bitten town to trust the first cowboy she met. But Jacob's hand was tugging hers, and her baby girl, June, was starting to fuss. "All right," she said. Silas fell in beside her, not saying much as he carried her trunk up the street. Laurel noticed the way he made room for her and her children without crowding them. She noticed he did not ask questions. She noticed he walked like a man who did not need to prove anything. Mrs. Barnes took one look at Laurel and said, "You got strong arms and a quiet mouth, that's all I need. You start tomorrow." Laurel got the room upstairs. It smelled like old wood and soap. The bed creaked, but it held. That night, after the children were asleep, she sat at the window and looked out over the town. It was small, just a church, the store, livery, saloon, and a few houses tucked between cottonwoods. The mountains stood watch in the distance. She did not expect to see him again. But the next morning, Silas was there, waiting outside the boarding house with 2 cups of coffee. One he handed to her without a word. Laurel blinked at it, then took it. "You always this helpful?" she asked. "No. Just to women who look like they got steel in their spine but splinters in their heart." She sipped. It burned going down, but it was strong, like him. "I'm not staying long," she said. "Just till I can figure out where next." "Sure," he said, "but while you are here, I'll be around. In case you need anything." Laurel did not answer. She went inside and got to work. Days passed. Then a week. Laurel scrubbed dishes and mended sheets and learned the rhythm of the town. Jacob started helping out at the stables, feeding the horses and coming home with straw in his hair. June learned to smile again. Laurel kept her head down, speaking only when needed, but Silas kept showing up. He fixed the broken latch on her window. He brought extra firewood when the nights turned cold. He taught Jacob how to ride a pony and carved a little wooden horse for June. And he never asked what she was running from. One evening, when the children were asleep, Laurel sat out on the porch. The stars were sharp above, the air cold. Silas joined her, his boots quiet on the step. "You do not have to keep doing all this," she said. "I know," he said. "Then why are you?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Because I know what it is to lose something, and I know what it is to need someone to just sit a while." Laurel looked at him. "You lose someone," he nodded once. "Wife, 5 years ago, fever took her." "No children?" Silence passed between them, not heavy, just real. Laurel said, "My husband left, took my father's horse and all our money, rode out 2 years ago, said he would send for us. Never did." Silas looked at her. "I am sorry," she shrugged. "I am not." "He was not kind," Silas's jaw flexed. "You deserve kindness." The words slid into her chest like warmth. She shook her head. "I told you I ain't looking for love." "I know," Silas said. "Just sit a while." That night, Laurel lay awake longer than usual, not from fear, from something else. Something quieter. The next morning, Jacob ran into the kitchen breathless. "Mama, June's gone." Laurel dropped the dish she was holding. "What?" "I woke up and she was not in her crib." Laurel's knees buckled. Where is she? She was crying early. I fell back asleep. Laurel was already running, barefoot down the steps, panic clawing at her throat. She burst into the street. June, June! Silas was there in seconds, swinging onto his horse. She would not get far. We will find her. I do not know, she just started walking last week. Silas rode toward the edge of town, scanning the ground. Laurel followed on foot, heart pounding. Then, a half-mile out by the creek, they saw her June, sitting in the grass, laughing at the way the water splashed her boot. Laurel dropped to her knees and scooped her up, sobbing into her hair. You scared me, baby girl. Silas dismounted, kneeling beside her. She is all right. Laurel nodded, tears streaking her face. She looked at him, eyes raw. Thank you. He brushed a leaf from June's hair. Always. They walked back slowly. Silas carried June, his hand resting gently on her back. Laurel walked beside him, close enough to feel the heat of his arm. That night, after the children were in bed, Laurel found him outside again. She sat beside him. He looked over. You all right? She nodded. You were right, I have been running. Silas did not answer, just waited. I thought I was done with men, thought I could not trust anyone again. I am not him, Silas said softly. I know. She reached out, touching his hand. I ain't looking for love, she whispered. I know, he said, turning his palm to hold hers. Just sit a while. And she did. The cottonwoods along the creek had turned gold by the time Laurel found herself lingering at the edge of Silas's pasture. Jacob balanced on the fence rail beside her. He was watching Silas mend a bit of fencing with a quiet focus Laurel had come to recognize. The kind that said a man didn't mind being alone, but didn't mind company either. Mama, Jacob said, swinging his booted feet. Mr. Fletcher said I can come by after chores. Help brush down the horses, maybe ride again. Laurel kept her eyes on Silas. Did he now? He told me I've got good hands. Jacob grinned, then glanced up at her. Do you think he's lonely? Laurel didn't answer right away. That's not always a bad thing. Silas straightened, brushing his palms on his trousers. When he spotted them, he lifted a hand in greeting. His sleeve was torn at the elbow, a thin line of blood showing where a nail had caught him. Laurel clicked her tongue and climbed down from the fence. You're bleeding. He looked at her arm, then gave a small shrug. Didn't notice till just now. She reached into her apron and pulled out the strip of linen she'd planned to use to patch Jacob's trousers. Hold still. Silas stood quiet while she wrapped the cloth firm around his arm. His skin was warm, the muscle beneath it solid. The wind tugged at her hair and she didn't bother to fix it. You always carry bandages? He asked. I have 2 children, she said. I carry what I need. His eyes softened, but he didn't speak. Jacob hopped down from the fence and wandered toward the barn, whistling a tune he'd picked up from the blacksmith's boy. Laurel finished the bandage and stepped back. There, won't hold forever, but it'll do. Silas flexed his arm once. You've got steady hands. I was married to a man with more pride than sense. Spent a lot of time patching him up. Silas nodded slowly. Can't say I ever needed much tending, until now. Laurel tucked the rest of the cloth into her pocket. You could have asked. I figured you'd see it sooner or later. She looked out past the pasture where a hawk circled high above. You always wait on people to notice you need something, only the ones I trust to see it. She didn't say anything to that. Instead, she turned toward the barn where Jacob was already dragging a curry comb along the side of a patient old mare. Do you want supper? She asked over her shoulder. Silas blinked. What's the occasion? Jacob's been asking if we could eat with someone who isn't Mrs. Barnes? Silas leaned against the post. I got beans and bacon, might be a squash left from the last trade. I've got cornmeal and salt. He nodded once. Sundown then? Laurel didn't wait for more. She called for Jacob and walked back toward town, June already stirring in her sling. That evening, the 3 of them crossed the dusty path to Silas's cabin. The place was clean but plain, with a roof patched in 2 different kinds of cedar and a porch that creaked under their weight. Silas had set out a long bench beside the fire pit, and the smell of wood smoke lingered in the air. You live alone? Laurel asked as he opened the door. Since the day I built it. Inside, the hearth glowed low, casting amber light on the plank floor. Laurel laid June in a woven cradle beside the fire, and Jacob settled by the window, peering out like he was guarding something. Silas stirred the pot on the stove, then handed Laurel a tin plate. "You ever think about building something for yourself?" he asked. She sat, balancing the plate on her knees. "I think about safety first, then comfort. And after that," Laurel looked at her children, "maybe peace. I wouldn't know what to do with it yet, but I'd like to learn." They ate in silence for a while. The food was simple, but hot. Afterward, Silas poured water from the kettle into a basin and handed Laurel a cloth for June. She wiped the baby's hands, then held her in the crook of her arm as she rocked gently by the fire. Silas leaned back in his chair. "I've seen a lot of folks pass through this territory. Most don't stay long, some don't want to, but you don't strike me as passing through anymore." Laurel didn't answer right away. She watched Jacob curl up on a wool blanket near the hearth, his lashes already dipped low. "I told myself I wouldn't grow roots again," she said softly. "Every time I have, something tears them up." Silas looked into the fire. "Sometimes roots grow quiet, slow. You don't even know they're there till a storm hits and you realize you're still standing." Laurel met his gaze. "What if I'm tired of storms? Then maybe you've earned stillness." She didn't look away. "You speak like a man who's already found it." "I speak like a man who sees it in front of him." The baby stirred and Laurel rose, settling June against her shoulder. She moved to the door, pausing with her hand on the latch. "I don't know what this is," she said without turning. "It doesn't have to be anything yet," Silas replied. She looked over her shoulder then. "But you'll still be here, I'll be here. Whether you sit a while or stay longer." Laurel looked down at June's soft breath against her collarbone. The fire cracked behind her. Jacob shifted in his sleep. She nodded once. "Then I'll see you tomorrow." Silas didn't smile. He just reached for the kettle and poured her the last of the warm water. "Bring the cornmeal next time. I'll trade you for a jar of apple preserves." Laurel's eyes held his for a moment longer. Then she stepped out into the cool night, her footsteps quiet on the earth below. The first frost came down quiet, silvering the rooftops and stiffening the creek's muddy edge. Laurel stood outside the boarding house before sunrise, apron in hand, the air sharp against her cheeks. She had never liked the cold much, but this morning it steadied her. Jacob was still sleeping upstairs, curled beneath the quilt she had patched with pieces of his old shirts. June had already stirred, fussed, and fallen back asleep in the crook of Laurel's arm while she dressed. Mrs. Barnes was due back from Helena in 2 days, and Laurel would have the kitchen to herself until then. She gathered her shawl tighter and crossed the street, her boots whispering against the frost-hardened dirt. Silas's cabin stood quiet in the gray light, smoke trailing from the chimney. No sounds came from inside, but the door was unlatched when she knocked. "Saddles slipped its girth," Silas's voice called from behind the barn. Laurel stepped inside to warm her hands. The cradle by the hearth remained where she'd last laid June during supper 2 nights ago. One of Jacob's old socks was folded beside it, likely forgotten when he'd kicked off his boots. She picked it up, smoothing it once before placing it on the hearthstone. Silas entered with a tremble of wind behind him, hat pushed back and a fresh scrape across one knuckle. "You always let folks walk into your house. I heard your step. You walk like someone who means to stay." Laurel raised a brow. "You saying I stomp? I'm saying you don't flinch when the floorboards creak." She glanced at his hand. "That colt of yours give you trouble, wants to be wild. Doesn't know he's safer with the gate shut." Laurel didn't say anything to that. She turned toward the stove. "I brought cornmeal, thought we could try that trade." He nodded once and took it from her, setting it beside the kettle. "Apple preserves are in the cellar." "I'll fetch them." When he returned, the jar was cool in his hand, beeswax still sealed tight at its lid. "You put this up yourself?" she asked. "Picked the apples just north of here. Took all day, worth it though." Laurel held the jar to the light. The preserves glowed amber, thick and honest. "You always do things the long way. If it holds longer, it's worth the wait." They stood in the quiet for a moment. The logs in the hearth hissed and cracked. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked suddenly. Silas looked over. "I did, right after she passed. Thought I'd ride south, maybe into Arizona territory, but I had a horse bury its leg in a prairie dog's hole. Took it as a sign." "So you stayed because of a lame horse?" "I stayed because sometimes a broken thing tells you where to stop." Laurel leaned her hip against the table. "I used to dream about California, heard the sea smells like salt and the wind never cuts. You still dream about it?" "I don't dream much anymore." Silas crossed the room and set the jar on the shelf. "Maybe you should." She watched him carefully. "You think dreams matter?" "I think they're what we hold when everything else is gone." Laurel turned toward the window. The sun had just begun to break over the ridgeline, gold lights sliding along the rooftops. "Jacob wants to help with the fencing again," she said. "He's good with his hands." "Learns quick." He asked if you'd teach him to shoe a horse. Silas's expression didn't shift, but something gentled in his posture. "He's welcome. When the ground thaws a bit, I'll show him how to set the nails so the hoof doesn't split. He'll like that." She took a step toward the door, fingers brushing the edge of the cradle as she passed. "You don't have to go yet," Silas said. "I've got dough rising. I'll walk you back." Laurel hesitated, then nodded. They stepped into the cold together, boots crunching the frost. The sky had turned a clear blue, the kind that meant no snow just yet. As they reached the corner by the store, Silas slowed. "There's a barn raising next week," he said. "Widow Emmons's son is building up near the ridge." Laurel looked at him. "You planning to go?" "I am. Every hand helps." "You asking if I'll come?" "I'm saying I'd like to see you there." She studied him, then gave a small nod. "I'll bring biscuits." He touched the brim of his hat. "You make them with lard or butter, depends on what's left in the pantry." Silas gave a quiet breath, just shy of a laugh. "Either way, I'll be glad of him." Laurel stepped onto the boarding house porch, hand resting on the rail. "Silas," he turned, "I'm not making promises, I'm not asking for any." She looked at the sky, then back at him. "But I'm still here. That's enough." She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. Then she lifted her shawl, turned the latch, and disappeared inside. Silas stood there a moment longer, boots firm on the frozen ground, before walking back toward his place, where the fire still burned steady. By late November, the wind came down from the hills colder and sharper, prying between boards and under coats. Laurel had taken in mending to stretch her wages, her needle moving late into the night by lamp glow. The extra coin went toward wool for Jacob's coat, and a kettle of bare grease from a trapper passing through. She rubbed it into June's cheeks each morning before they stepped outside, the scent thick and clean. Silas stopped by less often now, not out of absence but rhythm. He came when he was needed and stayed only long enough to make himself useful. Once, he brought a bundle of fence slats that he said were too short for his own line but perfect for patching the boarding house chicken pen. Another time, he left a strip of dried venison on the windowsill, wrapped in muslin. Laurel found it as she opened the shutters, still warm from the sun, Jacob's name scratched into the muslin with charcoal. One morning, Laurel found Jacob sitting cross-legged on the floor, carving a sliver of wood with the small knife Silas had given him. He looked up. "He says you don't like being told what to do." Laurel set June on the quilt and tied her apron. "He said that, did he?" "He said you're the kind of person who makes up her mind slow, but when it's made, there's no moving it." She didn't answer, only bent to light the stove. Jacob kept at his carving. "He asked if you ever used to draw." Laurel paused, the match in her fingers burning low. "Why?" Said your hands look like they remember shapes. She struck a fresh match and touched it to the kindling. "I used to sketch patterns for my mother's quilts. She'd give me scraps and tell me to make something honest out of them." Jacob grinned. He guessed right then. Later that day, Laurel stepped into the mercantile for lamp, oil, and thread. Behind the counter, Mr. Lanson was sorting ledgers, his brow furrowed. "That Fletcher fellow left something for you," he said, not looking up. "Said it wasn't urgent, but I should make sure you got it." Laurel accepted the folded paper without a word. Outside, she opened it slowly. Inside was a pencil sketch, rough but careful. The silhouette of her porch, June's cradle set just inside the window, Jacob's boots lined neatly beneath the sill. Beneath it, in Silas's square handwriting, were 4 words: "You made something honest." That evening she walked to his cabin alone, wrapped in her wool shawl. June was with Mrs. Barnes and Jacob was at the livery, feeding oats to a gelding too old for work. Silas was out back, chopping wood. She waited until he paused, the axe head resting against the stump. "You draw," he wiped his brow with his sleeve. "Only when I can't put something into words." She stepped forward. "You don't think sketches are promises?" "No. Just proof someone saw what mattered." "I didn't think I mattered like that." He set the axe aside. "You do." She looked down. "Jacob thinks the world of you. He's a boy who knows what it feels like to be let down. I'm not about to add to that." Laurel nodded. "He told me you asked about my hands." Silas stepped closer, careful and still. "They tell a lot about a person. Yours hold steady even when you're scared." "I used to draw to keep from disappearing." He didn't speak. The wind moved the dry grass in slow ripples. She met his eyes. "I haven't disappeared, have I?" "No," he said. "You've come into focus." He didn't reach for her, just stood there, grounded and quiet. Laurel closed the space between them. Her voice was low. "I still don't know what I'm looking for." Silas's mouth curved just a little, not in triumph, but peace. "I never asked you to." She looked past him, toward the hills rimmed in snow, "but I keep ending up here anyway." "Then maybe this is where you start." She nodded. "I want to try." "Not just survive, try." Silas's hand brushed hers, slow and sure, no claim, just presence. "Then stay a while," he said. "Just stay." She did. The snow held off through December, though the wind sharpened and the days shrank. Laurel found herself moving through them with a steadier rhythm, her steps no longer chased by uncertainty. She still rose early, still fed and clothed and soothed, but something inside her had eased. She noticed it when she no longer braced for bad news between every knock on the door, and when she let Jacob run ahead without fearing he'd vanish. Silas came by after dusk one evening, his coat dusted with straw and his right hand wrapped in a cloth darkened with pitch. Laurel had just finished sweeping the hallway when he stepped into the kitchen, shaking the cold from his shoulders. Mrs. Barnes had taken June upstairs after supper, and Jacob was curled on the floor with a Bible reader he'd borrowed from the church shelf. Silas set the wrapped hand on the table without a word. Laurel unknotted the cloth and examined the split skin beneath, resin still tacky in the wound. "Pitch?" she asked. Ridgepole cracked. "I was mending the join when it gave." "You clean it." "Best I could with snowmelt and a piece of flannel." She brought a basin and a cloth, dipped it into warm water and began to clean the wound. Her fingers moved with practiced care, but her eyes stayed on his face. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. "Jacob said you showed him how to measure a hoof for winter shoes." He paid attention. "Most boys his age want to swing the hammer before they learn where to strike." "He's not most boys." "No," Silas said. "He's got your eyes when he's focused." Still, but not unsure. She pressed a clean strip of linen into pitch pine salve and wrapped it over the wound, tying it snug. "You'll need to leave it uncovered tomorrow so it doesn't fester." "I will." Laurel wiped her hands and leaned back. "You've done a great deal for us." "I didn't count it." "That's why it matters." Jacob looked up from his book. "Mama, can he stay for tea?" Laurel glanced at Silas, who gave a single nod. "If your mother says so." She turned to the stove and poured hot water over dried mint leaves, the scent rising as it steeped. They sat at the table while Jacob read aloud, stumbling over a verse until Silas gently corrected him. Afterward, Jacob climbed the stairs without protest, the leather-bound book tucked under his arm. Laurel cleared the cups, her back to Silas. "I've been offered the schoolhouse position for spring." "You'll take it?" I said I would. He stood, moving slowly until he was beside her. "You were always meant to teach." She dried her hands and turned. "I wasn't sure I'd stay this long. I was, you didn't say so. You needed to decide it yourself." She studied him. "I've spent years moving for someone else's reasons." "I know." I want to choose this. Silas didn't reach for her. He waited. She stepped closer, her voice quiet. I want to choose you. He didn't speak. Just lifted a hand, calloused and wrapped, and laid it along the curve of her cheek. She leaned into it, eyes closed. I've got nothing to give you but what's honest, he said. That's the only thing I've ever wanted. He bent his head and kissed her, slow and certain. There was no urgency, no question. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his chest and smiled without needing to speak. They married in early March, in the clearing beside the church where the cottonwoods had begun to bud. The sky was clear, cold but bright, and Jacob stood beside Silas with buttons fastened unevenly, proud as anything. Mrs. Barnes held June and cried quietly, though she denied it later. Laurel wore a dress the color of cream, stitched by the women at the boarding house in a quiet flurry of needles and goodwill. Silas shaved, though not close, and wore a coat he hadn't buttoned in years. The preacher kept it short, and the townsfolk lingered after with cider and cornbread. They moved into Silas's cabin that afternoon. Jacob claimed the loft and filled it with horse carvings and folded shirts. Laurel unpacked her few books, her sewing tin, and the sketch Silas had drawn, which she framed and hung by the door. That first night, after the children were asleep, Laurel stood at the window, watching the last light fade from the mountains. Silas came up behind her, arms wrapping around her middle. You're quiet. I used to dream about California, she said. About salt wind and freedom. And now, I think peace looks different than I thought, quieter but deeper. He kissed her temple. You built it. No, she said, turning to face him. We built it. He pulled her close, and she rested her head against his shoulder, the fire casting soft light across the room. There was no fear left in her chest, no pressing need to run. The next morning she rose early and made bread while Silas split wood outside. Jacob fed the chickens and June gurgled from her cradle. The cabin was warm. The wind stayed at the door. They had nowhere to be but here, and that was everything.